Hello and welcome to the recorded Long Patrol video of Red Storm Rising, the GI-UK gap in 1980 conventional war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, i.e. the Long Patrol version of Patron 77. Now, this is a fun topic to do. It was an interesting topic to do. But I would also say it wasn't the only important thing I did that day, because also I announced this. I announced the expedition to Australia. And I'm going to do a couple of minutes on this to begin with. So if you don't want to hear about this, please skip forward. But I'm doing this at the beginning of the video because I know when people most watch my videos, and this is important. Last year, we did a naval history trip to Canada. And it was an ad hoc thing which just sort of came together. I was planning to go see Haida anyway. And that was going to be my trip. It was something big. I had been looking forward to writing the book, The Tribal Battles and Darings. I'd planned to go see Haida years before, and before the book came out, and to include sections appropriate to her, therefore, in the book, and Canada and Australian vessels. I needed to visit both Haida and a certain vessel called HMAS Vampire. I felt it improper to do those things without first going and doing some primary research and looking at their archives and their materials myself. I didn't want to just write a book based off what other people had written. I felt that would be rude. And so I was going to Canada. And Drac knew it was going to be a big thing for me. And he decided he was going to come along and keep me company. Well, that's great. You need a friend. You do need a friend when you're doing these sort of things. And then Dr. Dan said, well, you know, I have kind of been working non-stop throughout COVID, and we were going, no, as your friends and as people who know you, we do not realize that you have been working non-stop and haven't taken any holiday and have been basically trying to take yourself down. He went, you know, I'd like to come with you. And we went, yes, that is a good idea. That is something we will get very, very far behind. And yes, we now have a doctor with us. And then Gareth said, you know, John Bull, Gareth went, guys, you're going off to Canada without me. You're going to have fun without me. You can't do this. This is just not fair. You know, I have to come too. Okay, fine. And it was a completely thrown together thing. And it worked. And it not just worked as a group of us going and us being friends and enjoying the naval history and getting some great video content out of it for our channels, but we got to do things like the live from Haida and the live from the Sullivans. And these helped those ships. And the live from Sackville, which was the chief. The chief's cool. And then we got to see the impact of it as it went on. And the impact it had on the ships, and the impact it had on the museums. And this mattered. This was valuable. This was helpful to people. And so we started talking. And we started talking back in June last year. And we went, right then, so what do we do? How do we do this? Can we do this again? And we all went, we checked our bank accounts and went, we can't really afford to do trips on this scale every year. I especially have the joy of being a contract lecturer, and that can be especially fun. And we sort of thought, well, what do we do then? And we started doing some planning. Now, we've got a figure here of 42 grand. I worked that out back in January, March, and I was basing it on the prices at the time. Now, prices fluctuate, things go up and down, so yeah, it might not cost us 42. It might cost us more. It might cost us a lot less. We have a minimal figure we need to make to be able to do it as the barest bones. And with a lot more subsidy than probably the significant others. In my case, I don't have a significant other in my life. I just have my family. So I have less of a problem that matter, but significant others would like us to be spending. And probably more than is sensible in my case. But we could do it. And we would like to do it, because we'd like to see HMS Vampire, but we'd also like to see all the naval history in Australia. And the big thing that Drax said in the video when he was talking about it, when we were putting it together, was this was naval history which we very quickly realised existed. And he, and I, and Dan, and Gareth didn't know about it. We didn't know. And this is the thing. You could say, oh, well, you're British. Why are you going to know about Australian naval history? Well, for one thing, the naval history between Britain and Australia is joined for a long time at the hip. In fact, for quite a large period of time, it's indistinguishable. So, kind of a lot of the naval history we read, the books we read, and the stuff we teach, and the other academics and other historians we talk to in this country, are talking about things which, at least tangentially, sometimes completely, fixate on Australia. And we also talk to a lot of Americans and a lot of Australians. And this is the thing. I know a lot of Australian naval historians. They come across to the UK for conferences. I've taught some of them. They've taught me. I'm friends with a lot of them. And yet, I basically knew about HMAS Vampire because of my book, and I knew she was in a very large naval museum, and it's a lovely space. And I then look at the ship list and I'm going, oh my lord, there are US naval museums which would kill for this collection. Let alone the UK, which is notoriously bad at reserving stuff. There are engineers, I keep saying this almost every video about it, there are engines which survived from the Crimean War in Australia. We don't have any left in the UK. There are none left in France, there are none in Crimea. But they're in Australia. How? So, don't take this the wrong way, Australia. Perhaps you're doing a wonderful job internally, but considering the number of Australian historians I talked to who also, when I was talking about this with them, were going, we have that in that museum? I know we have in our museum, but would they have that in that museum? I think possibly even our very, very low, status in terms of what we can produce, and I know we did help the Sullivans, and we helped Hyder, and we've helped Sackville, and all these things, and that's wonderful. But we want to do more, and building our profiles works for them. The fact is, that even our videos, which are probably going to be watched by those who are naval history enthusiastic people on YouTube, are probably going to multiply by quite a significant factor the number of people who know where the history is in Australia. Because, it just, the outreach doesn't seem to be there. Or rather, the information doesn't seem to be getting out of each bubbles. I know this because talking with the museums, I've loved talking with the museums, and there are still museums which I'm building further contacts with for us to go out when we go out. We have a list here of 22 days, 21 ships, and 8 museums. Well, that's the bare minimum we've organised. There is going to be more crammed into it. And we are hoping to do speaker events. We are hoping to talk with Naval History Society. So, if you do know an Australian Naval History Society, and it's one of the area or something, Australian History Society or anything like that, in those areas where we're going, and they would like to have us come talk to them, I haven't put a calendar together of the evening stuff. I haven't organised any of that. I am talking to people, and there is things going on, but we are happy to come talk. we are coming. We are hoping to be funded to go and sort of go. So we won't be charging. If you want to give us dinner, we won't complain, because honestly, we're carnivores and we're always hungry. But we're happy to come. So if you are one of the if you know people in one of the places we're going to, please get them to get in contact with us. We have an email down the bottom of here. questions@shipshape.org.uk, which is how to contact us is probably best. And we will hopefully have a wonderful time promoting all this history for you. But we do need your support to do it. And as you can see, we've already done quite well. We're at 2,000. Pretty much. And we need to make more. We need a lot more to come in. But that is all going to cover things like flights, hotels, rental cars, because on one scenario we have changed from flights to rental cars because the flight was cheaper and it was more sensible to do the flying, and now it's more sensible to do 4.5 hours of driving, which is probably going to involve me at some point physically removing a Master Drac NFL from the driver's seat and going, you get to pick which of us other certified drivers does the driving, but you are not driving the whole time because you will kill yourself. You need a rest too. In a best friend way, I love him dearly, but sometimes we all have to turn into each other's mother. I know, because there is Dan who will basically look at me and go, Alex, how much have you slept recently? Well, you know I'm a functioning insomniac, I'm fine. Go to your bedroom. Literally. Came out of his mouth in Canada. Go to your bedroom and get some sleep. You need to actually sleep. And there's Gareth who will go, are we hungry? Yeah, we haven't eaten in a while, have we? We've forgotten food. Yes! Look, I've looked up this restaurant. They serve food. This is why we ended up doing Buffalo. In Buffalo, we went to the original restaurant for buffalo wings, because this was looked up. So we went there, and we ate far too much food. Far too much food. But it was a lovely time. It was far too much food. And, yeah, we look after each other. And that's the important thing. So now I have done far too long on this topic, but it's important. So, let's get in at... I'm not going to make it 30 minutes. I'm going to make it to 14 minutes. So, please, there are some wonderful, wonderful things for the various levels. We have noted what many people are coming in at. Most people seem to be really, really liking the idea of getting the Iron Brew Challenge coin. That seems to be very attractive to a lot of people, and I can understand why. It's a challenge coin, and it's Iron Brew coloured. It's beautiful. There is a little video of the Iron Brew coin as it will look like. That's not, of course, not the colour. That's the sort of standard of sort of the design of the coin. It's going to be fun. It's going to be great, and we need your help. We really need your help. It's important. Thank you very much. So, without that, let's get back into this. So, as before, you will find down below links to all the various folders I managed to access, the various official documents, because again, I am not going to go into anything which is not publicly disclosed. This is not the nature of this channel. We do the history, but once we're doing modern stuff, i.e. anything post really 1960, and even in the post World War II, I am very, very specific about how I answer questions and about how I refer to documents to make sure they are the correct documents which are publicized. Because there are documents you can read in archives, etc., and you can occasionally get access to inadvertently, which have not yet been released for public information. And you have to be careful about that. Because that's part of a historian's life. And it would cause a lot of embarrassment to those organizations, and mostly to the archives, if you sort of start spouting it off and they go, well, we didn't mean to give you that, we were giving you access to those folders, and you inadvertently got that for a second. There is always a desire amongst historians, do you read a document, take photos of it, and then hand it in, or do you just hand it in? I won't say which group I fall into, but etiquette is don't discuss it till they've been disclosed. They're usually disclosed, and most documents are in a process of constant disclosure. But again, when you're getting into certain things, and one of the questions which came up during the live was, have you gone into, signals and traffic analysis and intelligence? And I went, nope. Because whilst Red Storm Rising, the book, is debated, sometimes I think it's set in about 1982-84, and officially it's supposed to be set in 1987 with the technology in there, but sometimes the technology and some of the things they're talking about fit more in 1982-84, but we'll leave that to one side. And honestly, considering we're dealing with a massive fuel crisis and energy crisis, it almost does fit more with 1980 when this is set, because that was the question from Paul from Chicago. Cold War conflict, 1980. There's the great crisis which I do use in this, the 1979 crisis. So it's an interesting time. It is an interesting scenario going on. But this stuff is all very, very much either still in use or the progenitor of the stuff still in use, or the progenitor of the progenitor of the stuff still in use. And therefore it's closer that you can make inferences, and close enough you can make information. And there are people who specialize in intelligence history, and they will walk a very, very fine line. I don't specialize in intelligence history. For that, I would go to a colleague like Marcus Faulkner, who is an absolute amazing historian. I've shown you his atlases, his naval atlases of World War One and World War Two. He is beyond belief amazing at that stuff, and as such has to be deeply respected for those alone. But when you realise he is very steeped in naval intelligence and intelligence history, and knows it backwards, forwards, sideways, from both the Anglo side and the German side in 2 world wars, and a lot of the stuff in between. And then you realise the fine line he walks with a lot of his publications, and how he manages to get them, make sure they're as accurate as possible, whilst also being very careful of the things you need to do. It makes you even more impressed with him as a historian, and even more value his skill and his capabilities in that regard. There are others as well, but I have who do this, and I've seen their works, and they've read it very well. But the thing is, Marcus is the one I've worked with. Marcus is the one who's taught on the same course as me at King's when I was doing my PhD. He was the one who... Well, I tend to use an example of this because, if I give you a personal story of him, when I was going through my PhD Viva, and I was having my thing, you're allowed to bring family, and people can come up to, basically wish you luck. And my mum hadn't visited King's at all, but she decided she'd visit King's that day to basically... She thought, well, whilst they're making a decision, it's nice for someone to be sitting around keeping you company. Whilst I was having my Viva, whilst I was having my exam for my PhD, Marcus found my mum sitting in the corridor. And he went, "Hello, Mrs. Clarke, how are you doing?" Because he'd seen photos of her own. And she went, "Oh, you're Marcus, hello." Da, da, da. He went, "Why are you sitting out here in these comfortable chairs? I've got comfortable ones in my office." And he took her to his office, and he gave her coffee, and he looked after her. So, why do I use him as an example? Why do I always say how good his books are? Well, apart from the fact they are really, really good, he's also a really nice human being. He found someone's parent in the middle of a corridor and went, I'm going to take care of you. A really nice human being. And a really good example of a historian to follow on that regard. So, that is why I bring up Marcus as when I talk about intelligence history. But he has to walk a really fine line in his books. And in this, when I was going into it, what I was going was, well, is this going to be an alternate history? Is this going to be a development of the theory, an examination of what likely would happen? Or is this going to be a complete scenario? And I decided from the get-go, and shameless book plug, it was going to be naval history and with an alternate history scenario of what are the theories about if this goes hot under these circumstances. And the first scenario, therefore, you have to put is, this has got to stay conventional. That was a big part of the question. A conventional GUIK gap, a naval conflict. It's got to be GIUK. And I spelled it Duke down there. I spelled it right at the top. A conventional conflict. So it's got to not go nuclear. And that was a difficult one. Providing a rationale for why it would stay nuclear and fitting it in 1980. Okay? So some people then came through and did comments on various things on the live, and one of them was, oh no, this president was far more likely, chairman of the Soviet Union was far more likely to do it than the one you picked, and went, I wasn't picking the one who was the one in 1980. Brezhnev is the one who it is in 1980. And he is interesting, but for the purposes of this scenario, we have put him in this mold. Those broadly speaking fit with his character and personality, but still, it is not quite the same. And you also have to remember in 1980 exactly what the technology around there is. There are none of the magic weapons that come up in the later 1980s. This is President Jimmy Carter. He has started what Reagan will then take ownership of, the investment which is going to lead to the massive defense build-up of the late 1980s. But Carter often comes across as, well, to some, a peacenik. He's very, very focused on trying to take the heat out of the Cold War and make things as calm and stable as possible. What a lot of people tend to forget is that Carter was an excellent submariner before he became I wouldn't really call it a peanut farmer. It's a whole peanut, industry and empire. And he builds it up into, and he's training to be a nuclear submarine officer. He's passed the test, he's going through the training. And this is during Rickover's time. So, he's good. He's loyal to America. He's proud of America. But he also understands the value and reality of war. And the danger of war. In a way, perhaps not all others do understand. And this is where it gets interesting. Because Carter starts and lays the foundation for what Reagan builds up. People often jump at me and go, Reagan comes in and builds all this. And I go, no, he doesn't. He builds the buildings on top of the foundations, which have been laid primarily under Carter. Carter doesn't invest in the sexy items, in the items that get a lot of attention, but Carter does a lot of investment in things like infrastructure. If you don't have Carter's investment, and the investment Carter orientates around, and it's interesting, you do get as an officer who goes, Yeah, everyone's going for these fancy programs, and Carter's going, have we invested in the infrastructure we need to support this? And this is one of the reasons why he gets, there are lots of people going, oh, he doesn't invest in defense. He does. He doesn't invest in the defense which makes a lot of profit for a lot of very large companies, because it's things like, can we build a dockyard? Have we got slipways? Have we got this particular piece of infrastructure and that piece of infrastructure? Have we got a crane? It's all the boring stuff. And I do love it these days that in most political scenarios, you get a reputation for being an investor when you invest in the flashy things and you do all that stuff, but you can't do all the flashy stuff unless someone else has gone before you and probably got a reputation for being miserly because they've invested in the basic stuff. The basic stuff isn't sexy, but the basic stuff is necessary. And that's probably worrying a few people right now. Because if you start looking through things like the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, that map makes it look almost nice and manageable. That map is lovely. To secure that, you need to invest in infrastructure. You need air bases. You need a SOSUS line. That's a line of hydrophones underneath the water. You need all sorts of cool things to work. I read an article recently about the potential Scottish independence. And I honestly, on that, well, that's political and his channel's naval history. But my view is always just let them have a vote, and when the vote's done, just make there a rule that, in the nicest way, once you've had a vote, a referendum on subject, it is closed for 20 years. Make that a standard part of all referendums. So you can, when you've had a referendum, boom, right. Now 20 years later, you can't have an referendum for another 20 years, so we can all just get off the pot, okay? I don't care what else changes, I don't care what happens at the national level, it's 20 years at least. Because you need, if you're going to invest in things which are long-term investments to recoup the value of, like infrastructure, railway lines are long-term investments. Airports are long-term investments. Harbours are long-term investments. They don't make a lot of money day to day, but they make a lot of money long-term. And they pay themselves back long-term. They are essential enablers of the world and what we live in. But they're not sexy. But you don't invest in those things if you don't have some certainty. And one of the things you have to think about when you're looking at these countries and the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, one of the key roles for Britain in the Cold War was not just reinforcing Norway. That was the job of 3rd Commando Brigade. Royal Marines. They'd be a brigade group going into Norway to try and help them manage the 3rd Shock Army, which was the army which was supposed to come down from the Soviet Union and basically smash its way through Norway. When people go, well, how's it going to do that? That's mostly mountains and rocks. And a lot of amphibious operations is the answer. A lot of amphibious operations, a lot of amphibious logistics. It's going to be entirely dependent on that. Plus, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if a small invasion of Finland was also planned at various points, and possibly a small invasion of Sweden as well. Although officially, of course, they're neutral countries and we respect it as such. But if the Soviet Union thinks they can win with it, I wouldn't be surprised. But then we look at the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. Why? Greenland is part of Denmark. So, Denmark is kind of important to this. Denmark is therefore important as both part of the NATO front line of Britain to defend it from the Soviet Union's air attacks, because let's be honest, any air attacks of Britain have to get past Norway and Denmark first, so yay, Scannies! You protect us. Scandinavian nations, you are our defensive depth. Thank you for that. B, if we want to block off the North Sea and make access to Belgian and maybe even German ports, Dutch, Belgian, German ports, possible for those convoys coming across from America, we need to be able to have a basically a Norway Norway UK gap patrol. So you need an anti-submarine warfare patrol going across to Norway and coming back. And Denmark is also the other end of the GA-UK gap with Greenland. So you think Denmark is one of the most important nations for British national security. Which is an interesting thing when you start talking to people about it in contrast to the Cold War, because usually the effort is, well, you know, we were putting a large army in Germany. Yeah, you did. That was politicians seeking status symbol. And what were arguably the most important brigades for us? Well, Germany, they're useful divisions, they're useful formations to have there, but from a British individual national security perspective, 5th Brigade, which was supposed to reinforce Denmark, and 3rd Commando Brigade, which was supposed to reinforce Norway, are probably two of the most important formations in the British forces. I know, I'm a naval historian, so I'm sure. So I expect everyone's going, yo, you're going to be biased towards the Navy and Royal Marines. And to an extent, you're probably right. But also, let's look at it. The Soviet forces, if they are flying over Germany to get to the UK, they also have to go through Netherlands, over Belgium, and possibly France, and the sea to get to the UK. That's a lot of countries. If they fly down the Baltic Sea from the Soviet Union, they can skim the Swedish neutral air defense zone, and then they just have to cross Denmark to get to the UK. Norway, they fly over or fly around. So from a security perspective, those two countries matter. And that's before you get to the GI-UK gap. Which is, how do you protect the convoys across the Atlantic? If you can block Soviet submarines and Soviet forces and Soviet nuclear submarines, and nuclear, not just their SSNs, but their SSBNs, especially in the earlier parts of the Cold War, from getting into the North Atlantic, you can limit their abilities to threaten things quite dramatically. And you can get those resupplies from America, those important pieces of hardware, logistics. You can fly people across the Atlantic. Yes. You can fly them across the Atlantic. And when you've got enough 747s, you can fly a lot of people across the Atlantic reasonably efficiently. But you don't just need people to move across the Atlantic. You need bullets. You need shells. You need fuel. You need missiles. You need guns. You need tanks. You need armoured personnel carriers. You need all the accoutrements you need to fight a modern war. And no matter what people tell you in terms of modern logistics and just-in-time delivery, etc., air freight is not great for moving that heavy stuff in large volumes. It really isn't. It's blisteringly expensive. It's blistering expensive, and you are going to run out of aircraft moving stuff before you move enough equipment for divisions. you're going to run out of aircraft. Why? Because airports will get hit. Because aircraft, they will try to interdict. Because aircraft need a lot of maintenance. For hours in the sky, they need hours of maintenance on the ground. And yes, ships need maintenance, etc. as well. I agree. But you can far more easily maintain a ship while it's underway, and the volume it's moving and delivers, let's be honest, a couple of ships can deliver a division's worth of equipment. But it will take days to cross the ocean. Weeks, even. The joy of the Falklands War was finding out just how far 8,000 nautical miles was and just how long it took to get there. That was the joy of the Falklands War. The GI-UK gap, that's closer, but the Atlantic is a long, long way across. The old rubric is that it's roughly 650 kilometers from the Soviet Union to the front line in Germany. To get across the North Atlantic, it's 6,000 kilometers. I'm never quite sure about how they're exactly spacing that and where they're spacing that from. It doesn't feel quite right, but there is an actual map. Not that one. I have it through here. No. Where is it? Yeah. 650 kilometers from the western borders of the USSR. 6,000 kilometers from North America. That's an actual NATO document. You will find it down below. And that's logistics. And this is where the GI-UK gap comes in. And it still has value today because, well, in the 1950s, this is the UK Defence Journal, concerns about the increasing Soviet fleet of submarines and new surface vessels designed for the North Atlantic reinforced the perception that GI-UK gap would play a crucial role throughout the Cold War. Around the 1950s, the United States implemented a passive sonar system, sound surveillance system, known as SOSUS, that could track Soviet submarines approaching the GI-UK gap. As other new systems were delivered, including surveillance towed array sensors, the SOSUS line became, in the mid-1980s, the integrated undersea surveillance system. But for some reason today, it's still known as SOSUS, probably because, let's be honest, SOSUS sounds so much better than use. According to the International Institute of Strategic Studies, Cold Waters, Cold War, GI-UK gap is categorized as a strategic transit route rather than as a classic and more confining maritime choke point such as the Straits of Gibraltar, Hormuz, and Malacca. Although broad in comparison, its boundaries still constrain those who seek to pass through it into the Atlantic. For those seeking to exploit its characteristics for defense purposes, however, it also consumes considerable operational resources. The gap's geography has tended to favor those seeking to defend the sea lanes of the North Atlantic from threats emerging from the north, but it is not a one-way street. Forces heading north from the Atlantic must also funnel through these waters. The naval importance of the naturally inhospitable waters of the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland, and those of the Norwegian Sea and North Atlantic between Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Scotland predated the Cold War. Aside from the extreme confines of the English Channel, these sea lanes are a gateway between Northern Europe waters and the broad reaches of the Atlantic and beyond. Yet the GI-UK gap assumed a new and evolving symbolism and significance during the Cold War. According to the RAND blog, Mind the Gap, the NATO alliance depends critically on its ability to secure the GI-UK gap to counter Russian intrusion into the North Atlantic and the support of regional relations to prevent Russia or China from gaining a foothold in the area may be needed. As Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and Scotland debate independence, the United States and its NATO allies could work to ensure that these nations remain under the alliance umbrella. By expanding efforts to demonstrate economic security and ancillary benefits of NATO involvement and publicly engaging with both communities and governments, they could help to prevent any potential fraying of NATO's influence in the GEO-UK gap. It may be time for NATO to adopt the motto of London Underground and mind the gap. It's lovely. Ah, well. The GEO-UK gap is probably one of the more essential scenarios you have to think about when you're thinking about the Cold War. It's also one of the more essential scenarios we have to think about today. Why do we have to think about it today? Because despite a lot of people wishing it so, the end of the Cold War did not end the underlying issues. And the underlying issues are that there is a very frightened, in fact a lot of countries are kind of frightened, but there is a country which is a very, very frightened nation, which has a large military-industrial complex and is not sure what to do with it. And why do I say frightened? Well, this is part of the analysis you have to put into countries, and sometimes it helps to imagine the whole country as a human being with a character. And the Soviet Union and Russia since then has, since the days of Stalin, to an extent Lenin, but mostly since Stalin, had a mentality of being under siege. And if you're mentally under siege, you are mentally frightened, because if you have walls between you and the outside world, and you are scared you don't want the outside world to come in, on anyone's terms other than your own, it's fear. Now the thing is, I'm not saying only Russia has this fear. Lots of countries do, and it's expressed in different ways, and it's different forms of fear. Russia seems to, well, given the legacy of the Second World War and various other things, where their supposed ally, allied with Nazi Germany, let's be honest, look how they treated their allies, that's not a good model, but their supposed ally invaded them. And the scenario that happens afterwards, and the Great Patriotic War, as they term the Second World War, afterwards. Let's leave aside the fact they invaded Poland before, as part of a deal to divide up Poland between them and Germany. After they finished off the war with Japan, where they again were fighting Japan over control of chunks of China, really. It's all fun and games, it's international relations. But ultimately, countries, some of them have a lot of fear. Some of them have a lot of hubris, and some of them don't seem to have a lot of thought. In fact, I can't think of any country which, when you think about it, really stands up as, this is a sane, happy, balanced human being if they are turned into a person. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a reality you have to deal with, because honestly, let's be honest, most humans, that hypothetical perfect human who is this paragon of virtue doesn't probably exist. At least I've never met them, and I've met a lot. Perfectly balanced, perfectly open, and all those things, no. That's great. No one's perfect. And countries aren't either. It's always scary when you say that, isn't it? When you say a country's not perfect. No country is perfect. That's going to probably get me some interesting comments. But no country is perfect. And it's kind of like a school turning around and going, we have no bullying ever taking place in this school. You're lying. The question is not whether bullying takes place. The question is, how do you deal with bullying? The question is not whether or not you're perfect. The question is, how do you try and make yourself a little bit better every day so you are closer to a version of perfection at the end of the day than you were at the beginning? Knowing you will never achieve it. You will never achieve that state of nirvana perfection. But every day you strive to get a little bit closer to it. Mainly because everyone's definition of what perfection is slightly different, which just makes it even more rich and beautiful. But let's get back to the GI-UK gap. According to the UK Parliament, the UK, the High North and North Atlantic... that's their lovely report. It's a lovely report. I don't think I put a link to it down below, because honestly, no one should have to read it if they don't want to. The United Kingdom, you can find it there by doing a Google search. The United Kingdom has played a leading role in the exploration of the Arctic, and the Royal Navy has been at the forefront of this effort. The Second World War provided a clear demonstration of the strategic importance of the region in the GEUK. We lost certain ships in it, and we fought many battles to maintain it. The Allied attempts to resist the occupation of Scandinavia gave an indication of the difficulties of fighting cold weather operations and the importance of having highly trained units to do so. The occupation of Norway by a hostile power brought the prospect of invasion from across the North Sea, and for the first time laid Scotland and eastern England open to air attack from Scandinavia. It also provided the reason for why Britain ended up invading Iceland. As we again got into it live, it's not really a nice thing to do. But the justification is, at the time, Iceland is theoretically under the control of Denmark, which is occupied by Nazi Germany. But also, let's be honest, they have the Althing, and they are in many ways functionally an independent nation. But basically, Britain goes in and says, "We are not taking the risk of you being invaded." And also, by the way, basing stuff here is going to really help close the gap and provide us with support for our ships moving backwards and forwards across the North Atlantic to deal with any German threats. So yeah, we're here. We're taking over. The danger from the icy seas and freezing temperature endured by men serving on the Arctic convoy was compounded by the enemy naval and air patrols operating from northern Norway. The heroism and unique hardships associated with this service was rightly recognised by the government with the announcement of the institution of the Arctic Star Campaign Medal in 2012. And of course we have Red Storm Rising, which is this book published in the 1980s by Tom Clancy, in concert with the gentleman who developed Harpoon, a very, very good and very realistic... I wouldn't call it so much a war game as a strategic scenario training emulation system. And Red Storm Rising is probably one of the better books written by Tom Clancy. It is often used, and I have used it in the past, as the basis and stepping stone for scenarios. And I've used it when teaching, and I've mentioned it in book reviews. So, the GI-UK gap is the star of that particular book, because everything happens in context around it. There are submarines going around, there are debates about how to enforce it, how to protect it, there is Iceland invaded, and the effect of losing Iceland on the GI-UK gap vindicates everything the US Marines who defended Iceland were pretty much planning on doing, because to make it work, I swear Clancy has to write a scenario where the US Marine Corps forgets everything they've ever learnt about defending an island and completely get caught with their pants down. They fight hard, don't get me wrong, they fight really, really hard, but they get caught their pants down. And this is further from that particular report. And I've left the numbers of the paragraphs I've selected in here. As you notice, I decided paragraphs 21 and 22 didn't fit in this section. So, paragraph 20, and yes, I skipped the first 19 paragraphs are wonderful to read. The admission of Norway as a founding member of NATO in 1949 created the only direct Northern European border between NATO and the NATO state and the Soviet Union, until the recent joining of Finland and the hopeful soon joining of Sweden, because that will give us the well, for NATO, that's definitely going to round off their Scandinavian Pokemon. And pretty much all the Baltic Pokemon as well. Although the focus of the concentration Europe was on the Central Front, on the inner German border, the northern flank became an area of leading strategic importance to NATO from the outset of the Cold War. NATO's defence of the region would have been directed by Allied Forces Northern Europe, AFNORF, a major subordinate command of Allied Command Europe, entrusted with the defence of Norway, Denmark and areas of northern Germany adjacent to the Baltic approaches. Territorial defence of Norway was essential to the security of Western Europe, and would only be possible by swift reinforcement from other NATO allies. Early in the Cold War, Norway would also serve as an important forward base of strategic bombers directed against targets in the USSR in the event of a nuclear exchange. Long-range strategic bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles would have passed over the Arctic in the event of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the USSR, leading to the establishment of ballistic missile early warning systems in Greenland, Canada and Alaska. A second main responsibility of SACLANC, that Supreme Allied Command Atlantic, was to maintain the transatlantic lines of communications. In the event of an attack on NATO in Europe, the numerical superiority of Warsaw Pact forces could only have been balanced by rapid reinforcements reaching Europe from the United States. The Soviet Navy sending surface and submarine units through the GI-UK gap would have sought to disrupt these lines of communication and prevent these reinforcements arriving. NATO used to run annual exercises to protect these reinforcement operations, involving up to 100,000 US and other Allied personnel. Preventing the Soviet Navy entering the North Atlantic from the high north thus became a matter of existential importance to NATO's position in Europe. In the last phase of the Cold War, NATO's response to the maritime challenge evolved into one of forward defence, advancing the defensive line eastwards from the GI-UK gap into the Norwegian Sea to maintain and contain Soviet naval forces in the Antarctic and prevent them getting near the entrances to the North Atlantic. At the core of the striking fleet built around the US and UK aircraft carriers, please note, I'll be getting this later, but there are no frigating UK aircraft carriers for the strike fleet in this period, by the time we're talking about the 1980s. In the nicest way, in the 1950s and 1960s, yes, there are. In the 1970s, for much of it, there are. In the 1980s, no way. They're Invincible class and Hermes. They're not part of the strike fleet. I'm sorry. They're part of the anti-submarine warfare fleet and the amphibious reinforcements of Norway. They are more than likely the close protection for that. They are not part of the Strike Fleet Atlantic. Although they probably would be put under the command of Strike Fleet Atlantic, as that's the senior naval commander who would take command of pretty much everything. That actually caused the whole debate in the run-up to Falklands War, but leave that to one side for a day. Because there was a Royal Navy Rear Admiral who thought that he would be in charge of the forces and where they'd be going, and there was a Royal Navy Commodore who was in charge of Amphibious Task Group who went, no, my strike orders come from him, you're in charge of escorting me. So basically, you're in charge of the escort, Rear Admiral, but the orders for where we go come from Strike Fleet Atlantic, not from you. So I get the orders from him, I'm going to go there, you have to escort me. And it's some of the fun, the joys of NATO command in a Cold War would involve some serious NATO to national, for want of a better word, I'm going to use a different phrase, but you can work it out. Fizzing contests. So it's fizzing contests, okay? I'm sure you can work out what I mean. In the last phase of the Cold War, NATO's response to the maritime challenge, I think I've talked about that one, haven't I? Yes, I got to that one. The UK from the Norwegian Sea at the outset of conflict to prevent the Soviet Navy reaching the entrances to the Atlantic and to provide area power to assist in the defence of Norway. Alongside the carrier groups and other ASW units, US and UK attack submarines would have played a key role in seeking out Soviet strategic submarines operating on the Arctic ice. As historian Dr. James Jinks told us, yes, this was a historian who went and made a report to a committee in Parliament. Part of maritime strategy, the aggressive maritime strategy that we heard about in the 80s, was that if you start pushing forward to go after the Russian submarines that were staying in waters that were familiar to them, you would then force the Russians to use a lot of their assets, their other submarines, their surface force, ships and aircraft, to protect those submarines. In the history of the Royal Navy Submarine Service, which he co-authored with Lord Hennessy, Dr. Jinks summarised how the importance of the Arctic grew as Cold War reached its conclusion. The maritime strategy and Soviet response to it conceptually transformed the Arctic from a natural scientific laboratory and region of occasional and exceptional activity into a possible battle space on a par with the Northern Pacific or the GIUK gap. Had World War III come, it would have seen combat of a great ferocity. So basically you have the GIUK gap and you have the area in front of it, and this is where you get the whole problem. Now this map does show this, because at certain points you have the Soviets forming bastions and having a bastion defence base, which is from the GIUK gap to the bastion, which is the entire coast of Norway and Greenland, and reaches down to the coast of the UK, to Scotland. And then you have the GIUK gap, which is the defensive space, and you have Norway, which you're pushing up, i.e. you have this area called Norwegian Sea, to get to the area of otherwise known as the White Sea. And guess what? Inside that Russian bastion is Svalbard, which is Norwegian. This is the fun we're dealing with. It is fun. And this is where paragraphs 21 and 22 come in. The maritime aspect of the defence of the northern flank was particularly significant, and the Soviet Navy's Northern Fleet, which was its largest and contained the highest number of ballistic missiles and attack submarines, had its main bases at Clarke Peninsula. Let's see, where's Clarke? Oh, look! It's... well, if you're looking at the map here, go down from the lowest submarine just a tad, and you'll be in about the right area. Which is within the Arctic Circle. In the early Cold War, Soviet strategic submarines had to enter North Atlantic from the Arctic through the maritime checkpoints of the GIUK gap to reach their patrol areas. Sustaining active anti-submarine array capability in the GIUK gap and surrounding areas just became a priority task for NATO's naval forces, led by Sakhalin. In 22, in the later Cold War, as the range of Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles increased, it became unnecessary for strategic submarines to enter the North Atlantic, to be within range of targets in North America. Let's be honest, most of the submarines, if you're talking about if they have a range of 4,000 or so miles on their modern ballistic missiles, can orbit somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, maybe even further south, and still hit most of their targets. Or, in the case of Russian ones, they can go and hide right underneath the ice, making them frigging difficult to find, theoretically. Now, with this enhanced missile range and in the face of effective anti-submarine warfare operations by NATO, which was greatly assisted by the SOSA system and other things in the GIUK gap, Soviet strategic submarines increasingly restricted their operations to the sea areas close to their bases on the Koala Peninsula, under polar ice cap. This became known as the Bastion strategy. And basically, here is the thing, and it comes back to a line from, well, honestly, it's a line from Terry Pratchett. And one of the characters in it, Commander, later Duke Vimes, reads someone called Tacitus. Oh, I love how Pratchett uses classical figures to provide inspiration for some of his people. Anyway, basically, he writes in that if you have an opponent who has a massive, well-defended, brilliantly prepared defensive position, fortification, leave him in it and go and take everywhere else outside it, because he won't come out. Well, to an extent, it becomes a two-way street. Here is the brilliantly defended, very worked up, very organised defensive position for NATO. And this becomes the brilliantly defended, very worked up, very well organised defensive position for the Soviet Navy. And there's a problem. For them to do their job, they have to attack in there, and for them to do their job, they have to attack out here. So what you create is a version of World War I, where you have this sort of naval no man's land in between two lines of fortifications. But actually, those lines of fortifications aren't so much lines of fortification as they are heavily patrolled, heavily organised areas with large amounts of presence in them of vessels of all levels. One of the other problems is that quite a lot of the writing about the Bastion strategy seems to ignore about 3 or so things. And there is good writing about the Bastion strategy which doesn't. But the trouble is, there are a lot of people who have latched onto Bastion strategy who are not. This always sounds like gatekeeping. They're not naval historians. And in fact, they're not naval specialists at all. They tend to be land power specialists and land warfare specialists who are writing in broad strategic terms. And it's often the first edition of their coverage of it, and then they get response, and then they refine, and their next edition, their next book is vastly better. But often they start treating bastions and defensive positions like they are actually lines of fortification, like they are something which you do not go out of, and like that fortress described by Vimes based on his reading of Tacitus in Terry Pratchett's book. The reality is, naval warfare is not like that. You cannot draw a line in water. Try. You can't. What you can do is have a massive presence and a massive sentry presence. That's what both sides do have. And hope they have enough force to prosecute them. But also you need to work on developing your technology and your integration so that you can have someone have the complete picture. Because, let's be honest, as the GIUK gap starts off with, there are lots of different areas. That socialist line is divided into multiple sections. And each section has their own area, and they're reporting their information back. And the trouble is, the smaller the area you're reporting from, the smaller your image of the picture, and the easier it is to try and thread between those different areas. And as the areas get bigger and bigger, and the line gets more and more, people have more and more of a complete image, those areas that you're able to thread become smaller, but they're still there. This is one of the things about the socialist line, etc., and all the developments that have happened on it since. It's really only, honestly, modern technology, and I'm talking about stuff which we've started applying to naval warfare in the last 20 years. And if we actually renew and re-engage the socialist line as much as we should, instead of having just left there in segments almost don't work, if we sort of rebuild it all and get it all up to sort of the same standard, it's only now that you could have the entire picture in a command post, and you could have multiple command posts which have the entire picture. So whilst you might be only in command of the forces in a certain area, you have the entire picture. So someone trying to thread the line You ring up your next, and the commander. Let's say you've divided it into East-West Atlantic, and you've divided it down the middle. Okay. There's submarines trying to thread the centre. You have a task group closer than I do. Your task group goes and deals with them first. My task group will come and support. How's that sound? Fine, do that. Because they have the complete picture so they can see the group still coming. And they can work it out together because they have the information, they can share it. But the thing is, it also, when you start looking at Bastion strategy, the Soviet war aims, what are they? Protect the Soviet Union. Okay, that's good. So, protect the Soviet Union. Oh, to do that, we must maintain the Bastion. And that'll protect the Soviet Union. Well, no, the Soviet Navy's not stupid. In the nicest way, if they just protect the Bastion, the US Navy and many of the Allied navies can sit outside with their carriers of that Bastion and pummel pretty much a large amount of that area with impunity. You can't defend a Bastion, that sort of Russia from that Bastion. That's basically the fallback position. The position which you have got to make as strong as possible and as present as possible. But in order to actually defend the Bastion, you have to go all the way down to the GIUK gap to make the Bastion work, in naval warfare terms. Including protection of the critical nuclear submarine strike capability, which is what's hidden in the Bastion. Somewhere they're hiding in the Bastion. So the Bastion isn't about the protection of the Soviet Union. The Bastion is about protection in terms of, it's the final perimeter of the protection of the Soviet Union. It's the final fallback position, and it's behind which you have your nuclear ballistic missile submarines. To give you an example again with the fortress metaphor, which is an imperfect metaphor, but it's a metaphor which is an accessible one. The fortress, the Bastion, is the inner curtain walls. Inner curtain walls. Russia, the Soviet Union, is the keep. You'll have outer curtain walls. And beyond the outer curtain walls, you'll have other defences. And beyond those defences, you'll probably have patrols of cavalry and horses going around, keeping a watch on the wider area. You want to have all that information. You want to have all that ability to have proper effect. The moment we start treating the bastions as the outer walls, as the outermost defence, as the strong, you have missed the reality of naval warfare, but you've also missed the reality of their role. And prevent/limit resupply to the critical theatre to support land forces which are fighting in Europe. Because if you can prevent the resupply, if you can maximise the NATO problems, you can win the war in Europe conventionally. Think about that. If the Americans and Canadians are flying over thousands of service personnel, and yet they don't have their equipment, and they don't have the supplies getting through to supply them with ammunition, all they're doing is flying across thousands of prisoners. So what's the scenario? About ruffling to time. Rules. It's being kept conventional. That was part of the stipulation in question for alternate history, and it basically makes things a little bit more straightforward to analyse. We are setting it in May 1980, so only forces available then will be in play. No magic weapon systems from the 1990s. Gorshkov is still in power and head of the Navy at this point. May was also picked for fairly decent weather. Let's be honest. May in the North Atlantic is probably about as... It's okay. There's not particular problems usually associated too badly with May, but it can get very cold. But there again, it can always get very cold in the North Atlantic, given half a chance. Okay, course of the war. Now, Leonid Brezhnev decides that the best way to capitalize on the 1979 oil crisis is to seize natural gas and other key North Sea, North Atlantic resources. Now, again, this caused some people to be very upset because, how can this really happen? Okay, so I need to have a plausible scenario. I am not going to just say they just invaded, because no one just invades for no reason. They have to have a reason in their mind they are invading. They are starting a war. And I chose Leonid Brezhnev because, honestly, there was nothing in me that can make Carter the guy who starts the war. Thatcher, no. Again, not in 1980. So, there are no real options other than to go with Leonid Brezhnev, because he's got enough interesting grey men around him, and he's managed to put enough power within his own office whilst being in the verge of getting to illness, so he's always sort of seeking a bit of luster. And the idea is that with the high price of oil and gas brought on by the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War, conflict, that the relatively low populations of Northern Scandinavia, Iceland and Greenland, will be easily consumed by the Soviet machine, and that President Carter will not respond because he's a man of peace. And the plan is that by seizing these resources, as well as the Soviet Union's own vast resources and the ones which are controlled through their satellite states, will allow the Soviet Union to control the world's economy and bring the West to its knees, allowing Brezhnev to achieve the dream of the global Soviet. Basically, his theory is this: if he gets control of all these resources, he can make Europe full. If he can make Europe full, then he can then start working on the rest of the world. If he can make Africa full, Europe full, perhaps then take over the Middle East and the Caucasus. Total world domination. It's based in a mercantilian worldview. Mercantilistic worldview, to be precise. I think I kept calling it mercantian. It is to an extent mercantian, but it's mercantilistic. Mercantian is something slightly different, but not. It's a philosophy more than a financial theory. Mercantilistic worldview, which is what, to an extent, typifies most communist thinking on economics, in that it's all about control of resources. If I was giving an example, I'd say it's the economics, in many ways, of Napoleon. And mercantilism was the economic system before capitalism. And it's what gives rise to empires and all sorts of things, because the idea is the only financial value is in something you can actually physically control. So this glass has value, but let's say a piece of paper, which I'm going to pretend for the purposes of this argument, although it's a pen and sword something piece of paper, it's free post something, is a share certificate. Now, that, in a mercantilist worldview, this has solid value. As long as it's a company which is producing this, or it's a company which owns the manufacturing facility for this, then this has value. However, if you're starting doing slightly more interesting investments, as most of the high finance banking as we are today, where you're investing money in things which are more ethereal, less tangible, it gets pretty complicated. And Mercantilism is all about control of resources, control of physical objects, and control of territory as the financial means. And you have to physically control these things. And it starts off with the process of these sort of forms of investments in physical things. And then slowly it evolves into capitalism, which is less about the control of physical resources, more about the investment of capital. Although sometimes these days that is inferred as the control of capital. But the first thing you should realize with capitalism is any control you think you have over capital is illusionary at best, fleeting at worst. So, Soviet naval forces. Well, by 1980 they have done a bit of a boost, and this is why I use these particular NATO documents, which are declassified, and the link is down below. Principal surface combatants, down to and including frigates and reserves. 300, of which 125 have been built between, in terms of cruisers, destroyers, and missile destroyers, and frigates. 125 have entered service since 1968. Missile cruisers, 25 have entered service since 1968. That's a lot of vessels. Submarines, they're even more. By the way, SS is SSK. These days we have to call them SSKs. In those days it was just taken as a standard that it was an SS unless you added something on the end. So it was a diesel submarine unless you added on something on the end, i.e. it was an SSN, i.e. a nuclear submarine, or it was an SSG, which was a diesel submarine which has cruise missile capacity. There's an SSGN, which is a nuclear submarine with cruise missile capacity. And then ballistic missile subs, and yes, there were SSBs, and yes, SSBNs. But the big thing for the Soviet Union, and the big thing for us when we're thinking about the Bastion strategy, and the GI-UK gap, and this whole scenario, is yes, that's a large area in that bastion, but it's not going to be a large area that you can move through freely without nuclear icebreakers. And they have a few of those, but not enough. And certainly not enough to justify a growth in global replenishment at sea capability from 40,000 tons in 1971 to 200,000 tons in 1980. Think about that. Now, the 200,000 tons is going up by over 5 times. Five times it's gone up by 1980. In fact, it's at more than that by that point. That's a massive increase in capability and capacity. There is pretty much nothing else there. Not even the cruisers, destroyers, missiles, and destroyers and frigates, which have gone up by that vast number. You do not invest in logistics to that extent if you're going to be fighting a short-range conflict just to defend a bastion. If you are just fighting a defensive bastion defense. Because the bastion is not the defensive position. The defensive position, as I pointed out several times, is the Norwegian Sea, between the bastion and the GI-UK gap. And Sergei Gorshkov, this gentleman, he knew that. And if this gentleman had tried to claim otherwise, he'd have had an argument with a very, very irate admiral who could probably do nasty things to him. But don't worry, Los Angeles class are entering service. There are a few of them in service. Not a lot, but there's a few in service. Mostly flight ones, but you know, there's a few. So what's going to happen? Well, theoretically, and the theory for the GIUK gap and the bastions, etc., was that NATO would pulse their submarines forward as deep into the bastions and Norwegian Sea as they could before war began, in order to take up positions, not take anyone out, but take up positions, locate enemy targets, and position themselves ready to intercept and engage. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Let's be honest. In reality, that is nowhere going to happen. That's a lovely theory. It's a great military theory, but here's the... Let's put it this way. In theory, your politician will listen to that and go, that's a great idea in peacetime. In peacetime, they'll accept that. That's a beautiful doctrine. In wartime, when you've got the actual run into conflict, they'll go, but if I can keep talking to this guy, I can avoid war. If you pulse your submarines forward, accidents can happen. No, we're utterly professional. Can you rely on the other side being utterly professional? Well, and if you're both being utterly professional, can you rely on sod's law and accidents not happening? No. So no, you are not going to be pushing forward. I wouldn't be surprised if submarines get limited to the Norwegian Sea. And surface ships will probably, barring of course Norway's own, will probably get pulled back to the GIUK gap defensive zone. Try to keep everything as low threat as possible. In contrast, as the Soviet Union's decided upon conflict, well, to an extent, it doesn't matter what they do. They can push forward. However, in this scenario, if you're trying to try and keep it conventional, and the reason you're trying to keep it conventional is then you can win and get control, and it's going to be taking a small bite. The idea is to go, for the Soviet Union, for Brezhnev, to take Svalbard and Norway. Then use the acquisition of Norway and Svalbard, etc., to allow him to pressurize and control further countries. And so he needs to focus this purely on Norway. At which point I wouldn't be surprised if you had submarines moving down. Now, would they be heading for the GIUK gap? Potentially. Because potentially the idea would be, let's put some nuclear submarines through the GIUK gap, put them on the other side, and have them disappear into the wider North Atlantic Ocean. And if they get through it in peacetime, that is going to give us something out there. We already have submarines on distant patrols in waters around the world, and we already have surface ships on distant patrols around the world. And their primary functions are going to be causing trouble. Because all of this is going to be about presenting NATO with dilemmas. What does NATO do? There are surface ships attacking vessels around the world. Do you send a carrier group to go and attack them now? That's your only real option. A carrier battle group has to go. Because, think about it, in 1980, what other system do you have to take on some of the bigger Russian cruisers? You can send your own cruisers to hunt them down. You can send your very valuable nuclear submarines. But let's be honest, your valuable nuclear submarines are needed for fighting a water in what is going to be a fighting war in a heavily contested area where there are going to be a large number of aircraft involved. And you have got carriers in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, etc. around the world already. Basically, having them clean up their own areas before they move to the North Atlantic or to move their attack position in the Pacific makes sense. But it is going to take time, so it's going to prevent you from concentrating your forces as quickly as you might like. Furthermore, and this is something which has to be considered in the broadest of terms, so dilemma number one is, how do you concentrate forces? Do you concentrate forces? Do you send submarines? All those things. Furthermore, the other dilemma is, if submarines break through the GIUK gap before there's war, do you detach forces from the gap, which weakens the forces at the gap, to follow those and shadow those submarines, or do you let those submarines go? There's no good solution here. There's no good answer. It's just dilemmas. Now, don't think the dilemmas are only going one way, because whilst the Soviet Union has an advantage in this matter because they know they're planning on a conflict, whilst you probably can't reinforce Norway directly, you can posture to reinforce Norway, so expect the Royal Navy's Commodore Amphibious Warfare to be standing his group up, and it will be here this time. 1980, it's the guy who preceded Michael Clapp in post, and to be forming up and organising probably somewhere, honestly, probably somewhere in the English Channel. Forming up the group in the English Channel, and because it's nice far away, you can, whilst it's difficult to keep things quiet, there's enough naval base, enough naval activity going on already in the off the south coast of the UK, in thanks to Portsmouth Plymouth, that no one's really going to notice a task group of amphibious ships forming up, especially if you say it's an exercise, and brilliantly if you get them together for a Thursday war, because the Royal Navy goes to war every Thursday, and everyone around the world knows that. Every Thursday the Royal Navy has a massive fleet exercise. Basically every ship is available, every aircraft is available, every goes together, and they basically they're divided into two and told to fight. So, you know, on a Thursday, if it's towards a Thursday or Wednesday, you can say we're forming up for a very big Thursday war. And whilst the Soviet Union is highly, highly suspicious, this will probably make some propaganda about it, the fact is they can't really treat it as anything more than it is, because everyone knows it's such a well-publicised thing. And often nations which have ships visiting the UK are invited to take part in the Thursday War. So it's a sort of scenario of, we can't really complain about it too much. I would expect the Americans also to be posturing, but I wouldn't be surprised if a plane loaded with a few hundred extra US Marines touches down in Iceland. Quietly. And they will disperse. And it's, how do you disperse in Iceland? Well, you get into a civilian 4x4, or sometimes a regular car, but usually a civilian 4x4, and you go to a nice place, and you maybe go for a hike, and take up a watching position or a defensive position. I expect a lot of this to be going on. A lot of T-142 Bear Fs out scouting what's going on in the world, because while ocean reconnaissance satellites, especially radar ocean reconnaissance satellites, RORSATs, are useful and are very capable, they cannot provide persistent coverage. You don't have enough of them. So you're going to have a lot of Bear Fs out. And they're going to be doing a version of what the Condors did in World War II, probably combined with some strike direction. In that, probably there's going to be a strike commander aboard some of them, who, using their own communication systems, are going to be messaging strike groups of backfires and other aircraft exactly what to do, where to come in, what to hit, at what ranges, and from what angles. So these are sort of your anti-submarine warfare, maritime patrol, and forward command and control aircraft. They're going to be shadowed in peacetime, but please note, the P-30 Orion doesn't carry any weapons. might be sensible to rapidly adapt them to carry. Well, they carry harpoons, etc. So maybe you can adapt a pylon or something to take sidewinders. Probably being sensible, but we'll see. But the thing is, these aircraft are going to be running themselves ragged, trying to watch everything that's going on. You're going to have crews approaching overwork, and it's going to happen quicker than you think, them getting to overwork, because there's going to be a lot of stresses. They're going to be worrying about their family. And you have to always remember that in the back of everyone's mind there's always going to be a threat of nuclear war. Now, whilst in this scenario we're doing everything we can to keep it conventional, because the reason the Soviet Union is trying to keep it conventional is they want to win control of the world, they don't want to blow it up, there are limitations. Now, the defence of northern and central regions. There is rather a lot more forces around than you necessarily think. The northern regions, i.e. approaching Norway, etc., have 2 divisions close by and 7 more divisions in not far away, with a total of 1,800 tanks and roughly 2,400 and about 10 artillery and mortar pieces, and this is roughly 1988 again. That's 9 divisions. NATO has 14 brigade groups attached to northern Europe, and those 14 brigade groups include the include 3rd Commando Brigade, and I think sometimes 5th Brigade is attached to it, and sometimes it isn't. It depends on the year whether they're included in the numbers. 115 tanks and 520 artillery mortar pieces. Yes! If everything works as planned, they will have support from naval firepower. Yes, if everything works as planned, they will have the support of the civilian population. And yes, if everything works as planned, they will have the advantage of being a largely defensive formation in an absolute nightmare of a country to try and invade, unless the government decides to not send out an alert telling its troops to be awake and alert for the enemy invading. Because if you do that, well then, as the Germans proved in 1940, you can actually invade Norway quite well. It's amazing if the government doesn't do something, you can actually do it. It's one of the sort of interesting things is that you could pin down a lot of European and NATO forces, a lot of the forces in the European theatre, if you didn't do anything in Germany. If the central forces just went to alert, dispersed, but didn't move, didn't attack, didn't do anything, just sat there, and the Soviet Union, after manufacturing something on the border with Norway, moves into Norway and say it's just a war with Norway. You could also have nations decide they don't want to get involved because, you know, Norway's a long way from them, and why do they want to get involved in a war when it's when it's just Norway? And Norway's barely any people, and it doesn't really matter. And, you know, do you want to have a nuclear war over Norway? You can hear the conversations now. I know I can. You will most likely have the UK react, okay? Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, she's not going to duck around. And you could have issues flare up in Northern Ireland because of the sections of the IRA which are strongly linked to that's the Irish Republican Army, which were strongly linked to the communist movement and the Soviet Union. Through that, I have a feeling if they did, it would be more likely quickly dealt with by the IRA internally than necessarily the UK authorities having to get involved. And that might sound strange, but let's put it this way. They were useful, and they were a good section. But I always have had the distinct suspicion in my discussions with historians who specialise in that area that as far as the IRA was concerned, they knew that they needed America more than they needed the Soviet Union. And backing the communist play to take over Norway and disrupting Britain while you're doing it is going to quickly cause them trouble. It's an issue. This is actually called the Fuse in that time, but it's not really in service till the end of 1980. It could have been brought into service earlier, but the fact is, interesting enough, these ships and a lot of the major ships which we associate with task group leadership of the Soviet Navy in a Cold War aren't around. So Sveldov class command ships are probably going to be in charge for a lot of it, but there are a couple of the Kiev class, and they're probably going to be important. I expect one to stay at least in the Bastion as its defence, and maybe the other one go offensive, but it also depends on where they are. If they're all in the Pacific, if one of them's in the Pacific, then it's pretty much out of the actions. It might do stuff in the Pacific, but let's be honest, the US Navy's Pacific Fleet versus a single Kiev is not really a nice thing. It's more of a case of you will die with honour, not a you will fight with honour. You won't probably get a chance to fight. The Soviet Union tends to form things into smaller task groups due to their data sharing system, but they're going to have more of them, and that's going to add a level of redundancy, because again, if you have more of these groups going around and they're in the support range of land-based air, they've got submarines around them, they're going to be more of an interesting thing to try and fight. As they push down, they are also going to be supporting amphibious operations. Now, in Red Storm Rising, the book by Tom Clancy, this is an invasion of... well, it's an invasion of Norway and an invasion of Iceland. I would say, in this scenario, it's Svalbard and Norway. So it's sticking to Norwegian territory. That's going to be an issue. Svalbard is well within the Bastion area, and getting to that is going to be an absolute nightmare for NATO. But NATO are going to feel they're going to have to be able to respond. Or rather, the parts of NATO which are going to respond. And again, this is the point at which I go, well, Carter is a very much steeped man of honour. You know, he resigns his commission, uproots his family, his wife and his children, to go back to take over his father and his family business so it doesn't fail, even though it's already losing money. Agree or disagree with his politics, do not say that Jimmy Carter is not a man of honour, and men of honour as a rule, and women of honour as a rule, when they have made an agreement, when they have an alliance, they are going to be loyal to it. They're not going to back down, they're going to do it. So, yeah, Carter will respond and be defending it, and so will the UK. Other countries are more difficult to read at this point. François Mitterrand is not president of France yet, that's 1981. This point in 1980, the French president is a quieter individual. I have a feeling he would, especially, he's close enough and he's got the legacy of World War II enough to, basically Norway was an ally in World War II. There is going to be a group who are going to literally get involved because Norway was an ally in World War II. And Norway was fought by their side. And Norway fought, and the Free Norwegians fought by the Free French and were close allies the whole way through World War II. They fought together. I have a feeling France gets involved and stays on the side. But basically you're going to have a scenario now where you're going to have carriers being called on to deal with, if once war's broken out, with the Soviet threats around the world, the surface raiders, and they are going to be causing trouble, and that's going to hold your forces up. You're going to be dealing with, I don't think ballistic missiles would get used because they can always be misread as being non-conventional, but they could. I think the assistant fluffy researcher isn't just making his point heard. They could be used to threaten land-based installations. Again, we often talk about anti-ship ballistic missiles in modern conversations, and it's often what's ignored is the fact that carriers and battle groups do not travel alone, and they have ships with them which can maneuver, but also which can maneuver and can fire back. But also, there are real problems with using long-range weapons to attack moving targets. Even if you can deal with the level of issues caused by the plasma, and people love to go, oh, yeah, well, they communicate with the space shuttle, etc. on re-entry. There are actual gaps and periods when they cannot communicate with the space shuttle and various other vehicles in re-entry because of the plasma build-up. And the smaller an object is, the more difficult it is to do so, because most of our communication with things when they're doing re-entry is by bouncing it off a satellite and coming down from behind it, rather than in front of it. Or besides its side. So if it's a larger object, then you tend to have more of an opening in sort of the plasma, and it's only at certain points it reaches enough that it blocks it up. Whereas if it's a smaller manoeuvring entry, like a MIRV, the plasma can fully encase it. It's wonderful fun to try and get signals through. But leaving that to one side, ships can do all sorts of things to dodge long-range acquisition. They can be going the wrong way when satellites are overhead. The satellites can be shot down. There's all sorts of things they can do to try and throw it off. But the point more about these sort of missiles is to realise that the whole of the GIUK gap is well within range of Soviet efforts from the hinterland. So Svalbard, etc. Norway, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland. There is a sliver of Greenland which is not covered by the forward-most base of missiles. You can cover Svalbard and northern Norway from Mongolia. So if you're trying to keep this conventional, you are also trying to get this war over quickly. So expect there to be massive diplomacy going on about, Norwegian aggression, Norwegian provocation, Norwegian threats, all sorts of people talking at various points. There are going to be those who are the useful idiots, there are going to be those who are the paid talking heads, and there are going to be diplomats as well talking away wherever they can. Blaming it on NATO, blaming it on Norway, everything to try and provide a cover, a maskirovka of sorts, because it is entirely an operational deception to try and keep it conventional, and maskirovka fits with it, and that is a word which most people tend to find out first in Red Storm Rising, but it's an old word. It's a word which has been part of Russian lexicon for a long, long time, and it is steeped within the culture. Basically, another phrase, and to use a more modern phrase, although it's not a perfect analogy, but is a more modern phrase that you can sort of go on, is imagine trying to gaslight not a single person, but an entire world. That is a maskirovka. That is it. Now, I think vessels like Hermes and Invincible in 1980, they're going to be attached to the Amphibious Task Group, which is going to be heading to Norway to reinforce Norway. They're not going to go to Svalbard, not until you've got a lot of Marines and a lot of Royal Marines put together. And this is one of the interesting things. They might actually end up inserting 5th Brigade into Norway instead of Denmark, and keep 3rd Commando Brigade back, because 3rd Commando Brigade are the Amphibious Assault Specialists. Now, 5th Brigade, originally they are built around the Parachute Regiment, etc., for their operations, because they were supposed to be quickly inserted by air. And they would go and forward insert Denmark, and protect Denmark. Again, this is important for Britain. One of the reasons why you had the trouble with 5th Brigade in the Falklands War is because the units which are forming 5th Brigade, most of those units have actually already gone south with 3rd Commando Brigade and are operating on the 3rd Commando Brigade, and then they form up using units which have been drawn together going, we've never worked with you before, we have no way of understanding it, and they also had no experience of doing it from Naval Matters. They had never been. They had all their doctrine. Everything was written for not even a shore-to-shore maneuver or a ship-to-shore maneuver, but a port-to-port maneuver. And it would work in that scenario, but it doesn't work in a ship-to-shore or shore-to-shore maneuver. They were treating it like it was a logistics move, a move on battlefield taxis, when they should have been treating it like it was a river crossing. I.e., you do not stay on the boat in a river crossing. The moment you're near land on the other side, you're over the side onto that land and getting out of the boat as quickly as possible. And that's a problem in the Falklands War. But that's something which, honestly, in this war, you probably find out issues with again. It's like you'd find out all sorts of issues with these vessels operating close inshore because the Royal Navy's orientated its radars, etc., around operating in the North Atlantic, and they're great, but the moment they get inshore, they have a colossal problem in terms of reflections and clutter, which is probably going to cause some trouble in Norway. Actually, theoretically, some of the old vessels with some of the older radars will actually provide a work better. Again, there are more of those around in 1980 than in 1982. So what's going to be going on? You're going to be dealing with a large battle taking place between submarines, at least, in the Norwegian Sea. At a certain point, the carrier battle groups are going to form up. The Strike Fleet Atlantic is going to come together. They're going to have their groups together, and they're going to push forward. And when they push forward, the amphibious task groups are going to go behind them, trying to land as northerly in Norway as they physically can, if not as close to the positions of the Russian insurgents as possible. They are going to be dependent upon overwhelming tactical air power. Now, here is one of the interesting things. You have a strange idea that's gone around the world at the moment. And the idea is that you need absolute air superiority. You need control of the air and control the sea to launch an amphibious operation. Now, this is normally used when people go, well, you know, the Falklands War, they managed to succeed, but they didn't have control of the air. No, they had command of the air. They didn't have control of it because the enemy aircraft could still get through, but not a lot of the enemy aircraft, and they weren't able to launch a lot of attacks. And yes, when the BBC helpfully informed the Argentines that they'd been using their bombs wrong, things did get a lot more difficult. But, saying that, they still had command of the air. They didn't have control of it. So here's the point. You don't need control of the air and control of the sea. You need command of it in the locality. So these carrier battle groups pushing in, people often go, well, you know, they're not going to take control of the entire airspace over... magpie. They're not going to take control of the whole of the locality in the North Atlantic. They're not supposed to. They need to control the area around them for roughly 300 nautical miles in any direction. That's what your strike group needs to achieve. Roughly 300 nautical miles in any direction. A radius of 600, diameter of 600 nautical miles, and roughly. And, you know, again, this is all stuff which is in public information. They need to achieve that level of control to be able to operate. This period, they have a lot more strike assets. One of the things you have to remember is that the carrier wing has shrunk in diversity dramatically. Okay? And I'm talking about diversity of aircraft here. We have shrunk down air wings. The Royal Navy is pretty much down to 2 types of aircraft, mainly for their carriers. It's EH-101 Merlins and it's F-35s. Yes, we can operate other aircraft, but, you know, let's be honest, they don't have enough of them that they're really going to be operating them that often. There might occasionally be things on there, and when they're in different roles, they will carry a tailored air group. But the air wing mainly is F-35s and EH-101s. The US Navy Hornet family, F-35s, and Seahawks. Yes, they have Hawkeyes. Yes, they have carry-on-board delivery aircraft, but if you think about it compared to the variety that you used to find on a carrier air deck in the 1980s, 1970s, where you'd have long-range strike aircraft, aka intruders. You'd have long-range air defense aircraft, Tomcats. You'd have anti-submarine Vikings. Again, longer-range aircraft to provide a broader area of control and spectrum of capability. Lucky you have that in 1980. So, what is around? Well, technically, HMS Ark Royal is only put up for sale on 29th of March 1980, and she doesn't leave for scrap till 22nd of September 1980. So, theoretically, having been decommissioned officially in February 1979, there are rather a lot of people around who can still fly from her. There's rather a lot of equipment which can still be flown from her, and if you've got a massive war going on, you could possibly get her back in service in 1980 if someone's prepared to put enough money into it. Central class terms, we've got Hermes and Bulwark. Bulwark had engine damage by fire in March 1980, but was used in LPH at this point, so while she's not going to be the fastest vessel in the world, she can still be used as a landing platform helicopter. So that's your amphibious helicopter lift taken care of. And HMS Invincible originally commissions in July 1980. Illustrious commissions in June 1982. So you'd think if she could have been hell accelerated up, she would have been, considering what was happening in 1982. So, let's be honest, it's going to be Invincible. There's no Ark Royal. And it's going to be Hermes and Bulwark for British, and no Ark Royal Invincible class, but there is a potential Ark Royal Audacious class could potentially be reactivated. But then you also have to draw the pilots back from where they've dispersed to, the aircraft back from where they've dispersed to in the middle of a war. Now, if there's no fight going on in Germany, that's easier. But if the fight starts to take place in Germany, and remember, if you've got two forces on very high alert, flying backwards and forwards across a border, staring at each other, issues can break out. So, these things could happen. And let's be honest, if NATO does stay completely hard together and does decide to fight, they might attack in Germany. I doubt it. Honestly, I could see West Germany going neutral. Because West Germany knows the sheer amount of damage that will happen to them in a conflict. And they might go, look, they haven't attacked us. We'll get wiped out. We have just finished recovering from World War II and the decimation of that. We'll be wiped out if there's another war over us. We're going to do everything we can to avoid it. And you can't blame them in a way, but there again, they were also the ones who, had invaded. Germany was the nation which had invaded Norway in World War II, so it'd be kind of nice if they did come back and help. It will be a tough political issue, let's put it this way. French have the Clemenceau and the Foch. At least one of those will be needed in Mediterranean. So one of those might join your strike fleet. Ark Royal, as said, I don't think she's going to be reactivated quickly. So, yeah, if your strike fleet's being formed up in June, there is a potential that you could have HMS Ark Royal as part of it. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's more likely she would join in, if she does get called up, probably in actually September 1980, if the war's still going on. And the war could still be going on. We are talking about weeks to move things around. So it's lasting a few months. May, June, July, August, September. That's only 5 months. That's roughly 22 weeks. It's not as lot. It's not as long as you sort of would probably presume it to be. Considering how long the Falklands War lasts for, and that's mostly lasting that time due to logistics effort. The Americans have Essex class, Hornet, mothballed since 1970, so she ain't being activated quickly. Lexington, which is technically a training carrier, but let's be honest, how short of carriers are you? Can Lexington go off and take part in the hunting of surface raiders elsewhere in the world? probably to free up a more modern carrier for that role. Bennington, mothballed 1970. Bonhomme Richard, mothballed since 1971. Orinsky, mothballed since September 1979, so could be activated possibly fairly quickly. And Shangri-La, mothballed since 1971. You have a few there you can get through. Midways, you have Midway and Coral Sea. Forrestal, you have Forrestal, Saratoga, Ranger, and Independence. Nice. Kitty Hawks, you have Kitty Hawk, Constellation, and America. Enterprise, you have, of course, Enterprise. John F. Kennedy class, which is basically an advanced Kitty Hawk, you have John F. Kennedy. And Nimitz class, you have Nimitz, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Carl Vinson is launched in March 1980, so don't expect that to commission anytime soon. It's only just been launched, it's literally not going to be available anytime soon. So pretty much the US Navy has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 carriers around the world. It can theoretically call on a 14th, which is a 14th, which is a training carrier, and a few more carriers, about a handful more that it can maybe activate in time and use. So the strike fleet will be formed up. If it's got enough aircraft, it'll be pushed in. There will be a general pushing of submarines to try and get further and further, and they're going to be battering from both sides. There's going to be submarines battering against the GIUQ gap, trying to get through and interdict both the build-up of naval forces and the movement of personnel around the world, and the movement of goods around the world. And there's going to be NATO submarines of the nations which are taking part, trying to batter against the Bastion, trying to batter their way through the Norwegian Sea, trying to interdict Soviet forces supporting operations off the coast of Norway. It will be an absolute mess. Ultimately, I think out of it, the odds are the naval nations involved will commit more forces to pushing through the Norwegian Sea than the Soviet Union will be able to. And I think the thing is, the Soviet Union's wider forces to get involved will face their own infrastructure issues because it gets very, very cold. And they won't want to remove too much from the Central Front. I think if the war broadens to include the Central Front, it gets very nasty very quickly. But I also think if it goes either way, you have problems. I think if the Soviets manage to start winning and start really push back and maybe make a attack run on Greenland and possibly on Iceland, I think if they're successful, that could lead to some very, very difficult questions being confronted by President Carter. And a lot of forces having to be deployed. I think also for the NATO forces involved, if they push too hard and manage to successfully push the Soviet Union back to the Bastion and start making inroads, especially if they manage to start taking down SSBNs and SSBs, at a certain point they might end up finding themselves fighting a nuclear war because the Soviet Union would rather go nuclear than lose. I think as long as it stays conventional, I think, broadly speaking, NATO will have an advantage at sea. However, I think as long as it stays conventional, I think that we might find that the Soviet Navy and the Soviet industry and the Soviet maintenance and infrastructure in 1980 is a lot more resilient and a lot higher standard than it is in 2023. I think we're seeing a lot of things now that are making some people go back and look at the Cold War and go, well, they were never that big a threat, really. And the reality is they were. And the reality is this is a nation which has fallen apart for, broadly speaking, 30-odd years. In 1980, yes, they had corruption. But it was the level of corruption which was sort of Peep's level of corruption. In that it was perfectly fine to be corrupt and have a side gig going on which was making you money. perfectly fine. In fact, positively encouraged in some regards. However, it was only perfectly fine as long as your main job worked well, as long as what you produced worked well. It's kind of like the shipyards in Britain in that sort of period, where you would get offcuts of wood being turned into things like furniture, etc., and sold. No one cared, really. Jervis used to get annoyed with it and go, oh, they're making money, they shouldn't be making money. Most people didn't care, because as long as they made the wood they needed, made the wooden components they needed to for the ships, the furniture they needed to for the ships, and it got delivered on time, on budget, to the quality and criteria needed, no one cared what happened to the excess wood. If there was a growing amount of excess wood being used and this interfered in the construction of the ships, then questions would be asked and people would find themselves getting hung. But the thing is, as long as the ships were getting built on time and everything was going through fine, no one else really cared. And it's that level of corruption you have in the Cold War period in most of the Soviet Union. So it's very different. Right, tomorrow it's going to be naval aviation. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of the GI-UK gap and a bit of a scenario for you to consider of how it could break down as being conventional. But the thing is, it's very, very close to our own current time period. And it gets into the case where you have to be very precise on the question asked. And this is a nice broad question to discuss. It allows a lot of different points to be discussed and a lot of things to be considered, but it's, still got to be broad. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you had a good day. And yeah, my own question is to you, and I would normally put a question here, but it's trying to balance that question, because I do not want to end up in a war thunder scenario of people revealing intelligence information to try and win arguments in the comment section. No, no, and no, and definitely not on Discord either. It's not my style and it's not what I want here. The question I would say this is, go back in terms of the GI-UK gap. Go back and have a look at it. And think about the history of that gap and of its utility. The fact that it's been used in Napoleonic Wars, the fact it was used in World War II. And the rapidity with which powers set up to use it, which showed they'd already fought it through. And look around at other positions around the world that are like the GI-UK gap. They're not really maritime choke points. They're not choke points like Straits of Gibraltar, as was said at the beginning, Straits of Hormuz, Straits of Malacca. They're not. But they can become them. And look at the world and look at which nations might seek to secure those points. And then think about it from the perspective of the Soviet Union. Because there has been several people recently talking about Russia and the Soviet Union and their strategic aims and how they like to have defensible positions. They like to have borders which are mountain ranges, which are strong defensible positions. And they like to have access to the sea, and their own controlled access to the sea and warm water ports. And think about the GI-UK gap and think about that in terms of other strong positions of control and defence. Because it is. It's a funnel. A funnel works both ways. You have to fit through this ring. This one. Okay? Doesn't matter whether I work from this way or this way. I still have to fit through it. It still funnels me down. Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you very much again for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. What have we got next week? Steam battleships. Woohoo! They're going to be fun. They're going to be fun. It's what comes after the Ironclad era, but before the sovereign battleships. It's a very small, distinct group of ships, but they are important for the transition. Important for the transition.